Quintus Cassius Longinus, Tribune of the Plebs, 49 BCE. Quintus Cassius Longinus, cousin of the famous assassin, would have almost certainly been the most infamous bearer of the name Cassius Longinus, if not for the Ides of March. A supporter of Caesar, Quintus Cassius was entrusted with 4 legions in the governance of farther Spain. To put it simply, Quintus Cassius made the least of a good situation, turning a pacified area into a hotbed of rebellion and sparking a mutiny which prevented him from following Caesar's orders to subjugate North Africa. Cassius's failure aided the Pompeians by giving them stronger positions in both Africa and in Spain, thus leading to 2 major and risky campaigns which should not have happened in the wake of Caesar's victory at Pharsalus and Pompey's death soon thereafter. Here is a story of corruption, cruelty, incompetence, and failure. It is the story of Quintus Cassius Longinus. Gens Cassia dates back to the 6th century BCE. The earliest members of the family were most likely patricians, but by the time of the late Republic, most of the surviving lines were firmly plebeian. This isn't necessarily a huge disadvantage, however, as the office of Tribune of the Plebs was pretty influential, and also the family was relatively stronger in the late Republic than it ever had been. There were 3 men named Cassius Longinus alive and politically active during this period of the Civil War. Quintus was most likely the first cousin of the famous Gaius Cassius Longinus and his brother Lucius. All 3 of them were relatively close in age, although if I'm correct about Lucius, he was actually about 10 years behind on the cursus honorum, and it's possible that Quintus was a full decade younger than his 2 cousins. It's also equally possible that he too was held back on the cursus honorum, and that he's a little older than the office that he holds might indicate. It's also safe to say, based on the honors which were accorded to his cousins, that Quintus held the fewest honors among the men of the family, at least the men in politics. That being said, we'll see that his claim to fame is still pretty solid, even if it's maybe not the claim to fame that he dreamt of as a boy. Determining the precise political views of a Roman politician in the late Republic is fairly difficult, not least because the Romans did not have political parties, and their allegiances tended to shift rather rapidly. But we do know that Quintus was probably the most committed to Caesar of the men of the Cassius Longinus family. Lucius may have been a bandwagon guy who jumped on at the last minute, but Quintus seems to have had a more genuine attachment. Gaius, of course, sided with the Senate, fought with Pompey, came home, and continued to express his dislike of Julius Caesar in the form of sharp metal objects. But during the Civil War, both Lucius and Quintus will serve with Caesar, and both will gain his favor and attention. Both of them also served as official moneyers earlier in their careers. And what's interesting about this is that all 3 Cassius Longinus members of the family have surviving coins with their names on them. It's very rare that you have multiple active adults in a given political family and all of them have surviving physical artifacts. That's just not something that happens all that often. Especially when 2 of them, Quintus and Lucius, were not big, heavy hitters in their day. So Quintus served as a moneyer around 55 or so, and his cousin Lucius was in that capacity around 62 or perhaps 52. Unfortunately, the condition of the coin is not good enough to make that determination with 100% accuracy. In the year 54, Quintus was elected quaestor, the first office in the cursus honorum, and he was sent to serve in Hispania Ulterior, with Pompey being the nominal governor. At this time, Pompey was holding down the fort in Rome for the triumvirate, while Crassus was going east with his army, and Caesar was in Gaul. So what he would do is serve as the nominal governor, and then have subordinates go out to govern in his name. Quintus probably was about second in command in further Spain, rather than first in command. We also know about Quintus's character from Caesar's general and continuator Aulus Hirtius. Hirtius says that Cassius was a man who had a great deal of energy, but that he was someone who alternatively was driven by either extreme avarice or vindictiveness and cruelty. So Cassius is someone who had a great deal of ability, but his ability went into streams of activity which were counterproductive both for building his name and for advancing the interest of the Roman state. And I think that the evidence in terms of what Cassius did very much bears out Hirtius' assessment. Of course, it's also possible that Hirtius met and disliked Quintus Cassius, but given Cassius' actions, I think that we can actually trust Aulus Hirtius' assessment. Almost everything that we know about Cassius' notorious second run in Spain comes to us from Aulus Hirtius' The Alexandrine War, which is a continuation of Caesar's commentaries on the Civil War. We know from Aulus Hirtius that Cassius was not the most stable individual. Just like a lot of his contemporaries, Aulus Hirtius heard about what Quintus Cassius did with a degree of horror, and he began to wonder what drove Cassius's rage and cruelty. And he believes that what is at the heart of all of this is what happened to Cassius when he was quaestor in his first run in Spain. And what happened was that, for reasons unknown, Cassius was wounded in an ambush by some Spaniards. As Hirtius admits, it's unclear why this happened. He speculates that perhaps Cassius deserved it, since he later, of course, would show himself to be very greedy and also quite cruel to the locals. However, Hirtius also hints that maybe the real reason why Cassius was so cruel later is that he was living out a kind of revenge fantasy, that he felt wronged in some way by the Spanish and wanted to get his revenge by extorting them while he was governor and had 4 legions under his command to enforce his writ. Whatever Cassius's motives, it does seem that he was fairly unusual in terms of his approach to governance, even by the standards of Roman governors, who, especially during the Republican period, were very rapacious and tended to try to enrich themselves at the expense of the provincials. In the year 49, when relations broke down between Caesar and the Senate, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius were tribunes of the plebs, and it was their duty to represent Caesar's interest in the Senate. Along with the outgoing tribune Curio, the 3 of them were the most outspoken advocates of Caesar and the men that others looked to express the will of their master. When the consuls of the year decided that Rome's safety lay with Pompey's men and urged this trio to flee lest harm should befall them despite their tribunician immunity, Mark Antony absolutely went ballistic. He stood up and started yelling angry threats and predictions of doom and telling them how they were fools who were going to bring ruin upon the Republic. As the other senators began to get angry for their part and to start threatening danger, and as Pompeian soldiers began to approach the Senate, Cassius and Curio decided that it was time to get the hell out of Dodge, so they had to drag the future triumvir Antony out of the Senate, and in all likelihood they saved his life. Had they not been there to drag him out, then it is possible that he would have been murdered. In many ways, that actually would have been good for Caesar's cause, because then this would mean that Pompey and his supporters had engaged in impiety. The tribunes of the plebs were protected by the gods. They were sacrosanct. But at any rate, of course, Antony does escape, and he will give Caesar some pretty good service in the next few years. That night, the trio decided to escape, dressed as slaves, riding in a rented carriage, and they set out for northern Italy, where they rejoined Caesar. All 3 of them, of course, would play a fairly major part in Caesar's plans going forward, with 2 out of the 3 meeting catastrophe. I'll let you guess which one had a good deal of success before things came to an end. You probably already know the answer. By the time that Caesar was ready to cross the Rubicon, Quintus Cassius and his fellow travelers had arrived on the scene and accompanied him on this momentous occasion. After Caesar secured control of Italy, one of his earliest moves was to go to Spain with several legions in order to defeat the so-called army without a leader, and this was a feat that he accomplished swiftly. There actually were 3 different Pompeian generals in Spain at the time, 2 of whom were actually pretty experienced, those being Petronius and Afranius, but there was no commander-in-chief, and Caesar decided to strike before Pompey had a chance to name one. Most likely, had a Pompeian commander-in-chief been appointed, it would have been Afranius, but that did not occur. Caesar was able to win swiftly despite being outnumbered, and he wanted to keep farther Spain pacified. To that end, he decided to appoint Quintus Cassius, a loyal man, as governor, and he entrusted him with 4 legions, two of which had been loyal Caesarian legions, and the other 2 which were former Pompeian legions who had served under the 3rd general in Spain, Varro. So Quintus Cassius is now entrusted with what amounts to a reserve army. It's a fairly substantial field force, and while further Spain is a place that can have some difficulties, and there was still an active frontier where there were unsubjugated peoples, this was still a pretty good situation to be in. Most governors of further Spain did not have 4 legions under their command. So Quintus Cassius had an opportunity to win some local renown and make a name for himself. And as someone in charge of 4 legions, he could always be called upon for more active service in order to really show what he's made of. But as you already know, that did not play out that way. As governor, Cassius would prove to be nothing short of catastrophically incapable of doing his job. He was deeply in debt for reasons that we do not know, and he needed to pay off that debt, so he engaged in a considerable amount of extortion. Just like a whole lot of corrupt governors before and after him, however, he decided that it would be best to allow his subordinates to also dip their hands in the cookie jar so that they wouldn't report him. Usually that's enough to keep people quiet, but in the case of Cassius, apparently he still managed to piss those guys off enough that later on they were willing to lead mutinies against him. Exactly how he pulled that off, I have no idea. Because his men were supposedly getting rich, yet they were upset. As for the men in the ranks, the legionaries, Cassius decided early on that he was not going to be popular with the locals since he was extorting them for money and since they had once tried to assassinate him. So he decided to basically do Septimius Severus before Septimius Severus by just saying, I'm going to reward the soldiers and screw everyone else. He offered a bonus of 100 sesterces per man, and this was something that was a very generous amount, especially since at this point his men had done nothing particularly noteworthy for him. He led a campaign in Lusitania, which is basically what is today southern Portugal. He stormed a town, and then he was able to use the money from that to pay off his men, at least the amount of the bounty that he had promised. So in the short term, he became very popular. But that popularity faded, and the men were looking for more paydays. So Cassius was forced to continue to engage in rapacious practices in order to keep the money flowing. Hirtius says that this was his key mistake, that you never pay the soldiers more than you have to, because otherwise they will become disobedient rather quickly. I think there's some truth in that. The soldiers will begin to demand more and more, and a lot of them, because they are living risky lives, will spend that money rather rapidly and find themselves in trouble. And this is actually something that's fairly common in ancient history, where soldiers who get paid well tend to end up in trouble on the regular. So how did he actually extort all of this money? One thing that he did was consult the local tax records and collect back taxes with a vengeance. He also would approach local equestrians. There were many Romans who were settled in Spain by this point, and he would tell them that he was going to be raising more men and that they needed to either sign up or buy their way out of service. Since most of them had extensive business interest in Spain, they did not want to leave home. So he got them to pay some exorbitant sums in order to buy replacements. And he did other things like that, which weren't entirely unusual, but he just did them to a greater extent. And unlike a lot of governors who might do them for a crisis, he was just doing this without there being a crisis to deserve it. When Caesar had first settled the province, he had remitted a number of taxes that Cassius's predecessor had levied, and it's also possible that Cassius just reinstated those levies, even though he was not trying to raise a full army or anything like that. There is the possibility that Hirtius just hated Cassius, and that he and other Caesarians blamed him for Spain becoming a complete shit show. And it's possible that actually there was a great deal of local unrest and Pompeian agitation without Cassius's activities, and that a lot of what he was doing was raising money to deal with it. But even if that was the case, Cassius still handled the situation extraordinarily poorly, and without a doubt exacerbated the problem. Cassius raised enough money to raise a fairly substantial army, at least in theory. In practice, however, he only raised 2 formations, one of which was an additional legion, the 5th, and the other of which was an auxiliary cavalry force of some 3,000 men. The auxiliary cavalry force was fairly substantial in terms of its size and strength, especially by Roman standards, so this would have come in handy had he actually deployed to North Africa as per Caesar's plans. When it comes to the 5th Legion, this was composed of local Roman settlers, probably mostly the sons of veterans, and this unit does not seem to have had the opportunity to ever really distinguish themselves. If you look up other units with the designation 5th Legion, you'll see that this unit is not among them. So the unit most likely did not last very long and was cashiered not all that long after Cassius's own demise. These forces were funded by local taxpayers, and the men of the 5th, at the very least, were recruited from the locals. Perhaps the 3,000 cavalry were as well. It's not entirely clear. And so the locals, who were not only having to serve in the armies, but also being taxed out the wazoo for these new forces, were not entirely happy with Cassius's governance. They were also having to pay for the upkeep of a full 5 legions now without a war going on. So this would have been an onerous strain on local resources, and probably also would have driven up the price of food. Later on, these newer formations would prove to be more loyal to Cassius than his other legions, and the only part of that which would have been useful would be the cavalry force, since that would provide him with screening. As for the 5th Legion, as a new formation, it simply did not have the fighting abilities of the other 4 more veteran legions. So this would not be something that you would want to test against a more veteran formation. Nonetheless, really this was the crowning achievement of Quintus Cassius's career, founding a new legion which went on to not do anything, and raising a body of cavalry which would only really fight in a large mutiny. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Quintus Cassius's old friend Curio was leading a small army in order to secure the area from the Pompeians. After some initial successes, he met his end at the hands of Juba I of Numidia and his Pompeian allies. Caesar did not want to have to go in person to deal with Africa, so he commissioned Cassius to take most of his army out of Spain and march across northern Africa to reestablish control. For Cassius, this was the kind of opportunity that he must have been dreaming about. Clearly, he was not all that happy to be in Spain, and this was a great opportunity for him to burnish his reputation by defeating a foreign foe and earning a triumph and some everlasting fame. If he was ever going to gain the fame needed to become a consul, this was the time. All of this came without the risk of significant political blowback, because for a change he was not engaging in extortion, and he was not going to have to fight other Romans. So this was all well and good. Cassius at this point displayed the greatest amount of energy he would ever display, and the man was clearly excited. He was rushing about with extraordinary speed, gathering money, raising troops, and really just having the time of his life. However, these additional impositions really helped to further alienate the locals, who began to revolt, and also led to discontent among the legions, who were not benefiting directly from Cassius's newfound money. So Curio's collapse would curiously lead to a similar collapse in Spain for his old friend Cassius. As Cassius was gathering men and money, he continued to do his duty as governor. Roman governors would visit cities within their provinces and hold court. It was here that they would receive petitions from local grandees, so Cassius was just going about his daily business. By the way, in general, according to Hirtius, Cassius was the kind of guy who would receive petitions, but if the petitions were about abuses by himself or any of his subordinates, he would completely ignore them. So he thought that this was just going to be another day where he would do a little bit of glad-handing and then go on to not do anything, and he would be leaving Spain imminently to go on to great glory. However, the local grandees, who were the descendants of Roman settlers and were outraged by Cassius's conduct, did not want to see him leave alive. The would-be assassins managed to wound Cassius badly enough to sideline him for weeks, but he ultimately survived because his bodyguards intervened and pulled him out of the fray. Among the bodyguards that Cassius had on his payroll were a mix of Baronians and retired legionaries. So he had an actual retinue of people who were there to protect him because he knew that he was unpopular and that his activities were objectionable. This was not all that atypical for Roman politicians, especially people who engaged in corruption in the provinces. These men were useful, since Cassius clearly can't take on a whole group of men by himself, and they served their purpose in this instance. In the confusion after the scuffle, it apparently looked like Cassius had gone down with a fatal wound, so one of the conspirators ran happily to the camp of a nearby legion, which happened to hate Cassius, and said that he was dead, and immediately the men proclaimed this guy as the new praetor. Of course, this pronouncement was just a little bit premature, since, as we mentioned, Cassius did not die. As news traveled from Corduba to the legions that Cassius had survived an assassination attempt, 4 out of the 5 legions rushed to the provincial capital to be by Cassius's side, and the other one, after having declared a new praetor, decided to kind of keep that on the DL, and then they marched to Corduba and reported for duty. At this time, Cassius quickly rounded up most of the ringleaders of the assassination attempt and had them arrested and executed. That action itself was justifiable and popular, but afterwards he turned it into a complete witch hunt and really lost the support of his men in the process. He would eliminate anyone who got accused by a person who confessed. So when he would capture someone and they would confess that someone else was involved, that person was immediately condemned with no investigation. That in itself is an overreaction and an overreach, but what really alienated the legionaries was when 2 of the chief conspirators, who also turned witness, were able to purchase their lives for 50,000 and 60,000 sesterces respectively. This money went straight into Cassius's pockets, and the men themselves who were out there hunting down conspirators and keeping order and had been putting down revolts caused by Cassius's incompetence, they weren't getting a penny. So discontent grew, and now the legions themselves were extremely pissed off and would soon start to splinter into 2 factions. The Cassius needs to go faction and the we will still follow Cassius because he's Caesar's appointee faction. If you want to really get into the nitty-gritty details of how this mutiny developed, I suggest that you read Hirtius' account in the Alexandrine War. Suffice it to say that at one point, there was one of the men in the ranks, as the men began to mutiny, who was a closet Pompeian, and he convinced everyone to write Gnaeus Pompeius on their shields. But then the men looked at it and they said, you know what, we actually hate Pompey. We just right now are extremely furious at Cassius and we refuse to follow him, but we want to stay loyal to Caesar. So the leadership relented, the name Pompey was removed from their shields, and then they began to look for a leader. Ultimately, they settled on the Quaestor Marcellus, who was not all that senior, but he at least had not been the guy who proposed putting the name Pompey on the shields. So Marcellus is now elevated to be the new governor of Hispania Ulterior, at least by the men in the ranks, and Marcellus will have the loyalty of the majority of the men in the army, the majority of the infantry, that is. The cavalry, which were raised by Cassius, will remain loyal to him, so this will enable him to stay away from Marcellus to some extent. For Marcellus's part, he sees this entire episode as a shameful tragedy, and he is very much battle-shy because he does not want to shed the blood of fellow Caesarians. Ultimately, Cassius withdraws to Ulia, which is a strong, hilly position near Corduba, with his small following, and his situation then becomes desperate because he does not have adequate provisions. Marcellus, for his part, follows up and lays siege, and he's hoping that this will be resolved peacefully. In the meantime, unbeknownst to Marcellus, Cassius has sent out messengers to nearby governors and allies, asking for a rescue against the mutineers. Cassius had now gone from being a would-be rescuer of Caesar's designs in Africa to being the newest damsel in distress on the Caesarian side. And it was not a great look, especially given that this was 100% his own fault. The first Roman ally to arrive on the scene was King Bagud of Mauritania. He and Cassius had presumably become friends, as the two of them had been planning Cassius's overland march across North Africa to the Roman province of North Africa, which is approximately today's Tunisia. Bagud arrived and began to attack Marcellus, but Marcellus, for his part, was able to hold his own well enough and was not dislodged from his positions. Soon thereafter, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the future member of the Second Triumvirate, arrived. He was the governor of Hispania Caeterior, that is, nearer Spain, and he was actually completely disgusted by Cassius's administration, and so he did not come as an ally of Cassius, but rather as an arbitrator who wanted to end the situation and move on. He struck a deal with Marcellus and then combined with him to drive off Bagud. In the meantime, he also convinced Cassius, who was quite reluctant, to surrender under terms, and Cassius decided that it was beneath his dignity to be escorted by Lepidus's men out of the province, so instead he refused a military escort. He took his immediate following, which presumably included a lot of his bodyguards, and they left Ulia and got on board of a ship. We'll talk about how that ship fared a little later. Caesar was sufficiently impressed by Lepidus's handling of the situation, which resulted in fairly minimal bloodshed, that he awarded him a triumph. Lepidus had not come anywhere close to defeating 5,000 enemies, but he had shown a great deal of good judgment, and while he did not deserve a triumph necessarily, Caesar was right to reward him because the situation could have gotten a lot worse, but instead Lepidus stood up for good government and possibly gave the Romans a good chance of resolving this issue, or I should say the Caesarians of resolving this issue. But in the event, things would continue to go poorly after Cassius's departure, and the province would be in full revolt by a year or so after Cassius was removed in 46. Not only did Quintus Cassius refuse a military escort from Lepidus in order to protect himself, he also just thought it was beneath his dignity to have to travel through lands which had revolted against him. So rather than traveling overland, which would have been safer during winter conditions, he instead boarded a ship on the Ebro and tried to sail the length of the Ebro and from there out to sea somewhere. And he did get all the way down the Ebro River, but once he reached the mouth of the river, the current was too strong, and his ship was wrecked somewhere near the mouth of the Ebro. He lost his life in the ensuing shipwreck, and I have to presume that this means some of his men survived to tell the tale, otherwise he would have just disappeared. Where Cassius intended to go is not entirely clear. We don't really know what Cassius' standing was with Caesar at this point, but I can't imagine that Caesar was terribly happy with what had happened, especially since he gave Lepidus a triumph for getting rid of Cassius without any real bloodshed. So I don't think he would have defected to the Pompeians, but I also don't think he had a place with Caesar either. Perhaps he would have simply retired to some obscure corner of Sicily or Italy. Who knows? At any rate, we would never find out, because Cassius died in a shipwreck, and that was the end of a tumultuous and completely failed political career. The legacy of Quintus Cassius Longinus is that he is almost certainly the worst Roman governor ever. The goal of a Roman governor was to keep his province happy enough that they were not in revolt, and that they were therefore paying taxes and supporting local Roman forces. In the case of Quintus Cassius Longinus, despite having 4 legions, he could not do this, and he failed at his job under conditions which were not really that difficult, quite frankly. His governorship stands out as one of the absolute worst, and I will have to look hard to find an example of someone who failed as hard as Quintus Cassius. The impact of Quintus Cassius is that his failure in Spain very much damaged Caesar's cause and nearly led to Caesar's death twice. Quintus Cassius not only failed to show up in Africa to deal with the aftermath of Curio's disaster, because his province revolted from him before he could get going, but he also created so much ill will in Spain that it became a hotbed of anti-Caesarian activity and would ultimately furnish a formidable army to Gnaeus Pompeius, Sextus Pompeius, and Titus Labienus. At the Battle of Munda in 45, Caesar would nearly lose his life in probably the hardest fought battle of the entire Civil War period. All his cousin, the assassin, did, by comparison, was to organize 22 other men to stab Caesar. Quintus Cassius, through his stupidity, raised up at least one major army against Caesar, and arguably his failure to go to Africa meant that Caesar had to fight yet another risky battle at Thapsus against a large Roman army. The only reason that battle was not closer or more fraught was that the army happened to be commanded by Metellus Scipio, possibly the worst general in Roman history, or at least the worst of this period. Quintus's antics were able to stir up so much resentment in the short run that his successor Gaius Trebonius, who was an experienced man with a great deal of military experience in Gaul, was not able to hang on to the province. He was driven out by force. So this shows you that Quintus Cassius left an absolute mess. As I mentioned earlier, Marcus Lepidus also was not able to bring the situation back to heel, and if you've studied his career, you know that he was a man of fairly considerable political talents, as well as having some military abilities. So yes, the fact that the Battle of Munda took place, and that the Pompey brothers had an afterlife, and they were able to keep a rebellion going even after their father was dead and buried, is largely on the shoulders of Quintus Cassius and his incompetence. That is a significant legacy, even if it's not the one that you want. Anyway, I'm Thersites the Historian, and I will be back in the near future with more Romans of renown. Until next time, remember that you can follow me here. You can click the notification bell and all that. I also have 2 other channels, including Spirit of Thersites and WTF Gas Podcast. Make sure you're subscribed to both of those as well. I'll see you later.